person, we'll see what you say. I know. I loved your idea. And John, was it John Davenport who said, write it out and that's a great idea.
I absorbed that, and I don't know that it worked, that I submitted it to.
Oh, okay. Well, the thing was, I got an email from Will saying, Phil is out of responding, Jessica, I want to be at home, but I really appreciated you looking at it and saying the only ones who really apply to us are these ones. And maybe what I'll do is just,
Like 11 out of 29. So, but I still, that's,
yeah,
we can talk about those.
yeah. But you're right, I don't want to spend time at the retreat right now. We could do it on a,
Yeah. So if we get those 11, email everything you want.
yes.
Or everything I got.
I think, I don't want to put that on him because he does so much of the research that I don't want to, and I was the one who got this email, and so I don't want to make John, you mean John Sartorius, not
No,
Dan?
I'm not dead.
Oh, well, sure, John, if he wants to do that. Oh, I thought you meant Sartorius, I was like,
No.
well, it sounds like you guys have a really good retreat with that national organization. Was that a week ago or 2 weeks ago? It wasn't just last week, was it? Oh, a week ago. That sounded really That's great. That's great. That's great. How's your shoulder? Oh. Okay, well, that's fine. I thought you were going to give me good news. That's the only reason I asked. Two bunches of what? From where? Really?
It's called Rudy.
Four doors down in
It's vegan and it's
Ethiopia. I have 2 decades here.
oh, you gotta go.
That's okay. I'm here to do it. Well, we'll see you Tuesday, 2 to 5. That'll be good. I will
Okay. Hey, good morning, everybody. I'm Bryce Hamilton. I'm on the Forum Committee, and I want to welcome you and all of our guests around the country, the city, who are watching online. I'm really pleased today, and I'm honored to introduce our speaker. Todd Otis is a long-time friend, and he has made a lifetime commitment to the common good. I really respect that. He served 2 terms way back in the 90s in the Minnesota House of Representatives. He was a state chair of the Democratic Party for a while. He made, I think, 2 unsuccessful attempts maybe to become governor, didn't you? Yes? Okay. And he's currently main point, a champion of early childhood education, and that's been a focus of his for a long time through the organizations Ready for K, Think Small, and Success by 6. He's currently co-chair of Clean Elections Minnesota, which is an important nonpartisan organization that promotes expanded voter access, transparency, and reforms to limit the power of dark money and special interests in the public realm. Todd's recent historical novel, Sparks of the Revolution, describes the events and personalities, including a relative of his from long ago, that led to the birth of democracy, and the lessons of which maintain relevance for all of us today. So please give a warm Plymouth welcome to Todd Otis.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This is so meaningful in a lot of different levels, and one of which I just discovered the other day. I scrambled to try to find out what James Otis's religion was. And I spent 5 years trying to do a book. You'd think I would know. So then I found out he was a Congregationalist. And I thought, oh gosh, thanks. And then Sam Adams and John Hancock and the people you've heard of in this period, many of them were Congregationalists. So I thought, how perfect to be able to do this in this church about these people and what they believed in. So basically, the story is this. It takes place in the town of Boston between 1760 and 1775. It is about the people and events that led to the revolution. And so it's a town of 15,000. So in terms of scale and understanding personal relationships and how they communicate, that's a really important fact. And so the basic story is about actions and reactions taken by the British and the Americans, and how those escalated, but also the planning and the relationships between the people within Boston that took us to this point. And so I wanted to just mention a few things. Why would I do this? My father happened to have the same name, as Sue knows, and he would talk periodically about this ancient person, James Otis, the patriot. And I frankly, when he would talk genealogy, I'd start thinking about the St. Paul Saints or whatever I was going to do. But then I thought, when I formally retired and I really wasn't working for money, as one of my friends said, I was good for nothing. I decided to give this a shot. And I thought I'd like to do a biography. But it became clear that it needed to be a novel, because James Otis, in the arc of his mental health and illness was such that he burned all his papers at the end of his life. And so that was very sad, and it gave me license to do a historical novel. And so I wrote it because I just thought it would be good, and then here's what put me over the top in terms of motivation. So Otis's claim to fame in the 1760s was arguing a case about the so-called writs of assistance. Writs of assistance were warrants where customs officers could go into your house or your home or your business or your church looking for smuggled goods. And they abused that power, and it was not a legitimate power, and it really made people angry. And so some merchants came to Otis, who at that time was working for the king. He was with the Admiralty Court. And they said, would you be willing to argue a case against the use of the writs of assistance? And he said, well, he agonized over it. You'll see in the beginning of the book how he comes to decide to make the big flip. Because he really wanted just to be a British subject treated with the same rights as other Englishmen. So finally he decides, okay, I'll go to the other side and I'll argue this case. So it's a February morning in 1761 in a courtroom in Boston, and he is arguing the case. The opposing lawyer was the guy who taught him law, a man named Gridley, which I just loved, that there are these little elements that are so, and so Gridley and he have had 2 years of intense relationship. There was no law school. And so here's the description of what happened that sort of made me think, I got to try this. The seeds of patriots and heroes to defend the non-senius animus infants, to defend the rigorous youths were then and there sown. Every man of an immense crowded audience appeared to me to go away as I did, ready to take arms against the writs of assistance. Then and there was the first scene of the first act of opposition to the arbitrary claims of Great Britain. Then and there the child independence was born. In 15 years, in 1776, he grew up to manhood and declared himself free. The person who wrote that was this young lawyer in the back of the courtroom named John Adams. So I thought, well, if John Adams says he kind of got us on the path to independence, I'll take that as wow. And so that helped me. How do you make somebody nobody's ever heard of interesting? Well, the validation by John Adams really helped. And so I think one of the things about the book that I try to impart is a sense of the concrete times, the way things were, the way people work together, some of the food you'll eat. Has anybody read the book yet? So it's one of the nice things said about it by Amy Klobuchar and Tom Ridge, who was a classmate in college, that it sort of tries to bring to life, not just abstractions, but how people were living together. And there are two things I'm going to ask you to try to remember: a date and a person. The date is 1768, and the person is Ebenezer McIntosh. Okay, let me try to explain why 1768. From the early 60s on, there were various acts passed by the Parliament to tax the citizens of Boston and the colonies. And there was growing resistance. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, then the Townsend Act. And so there was this growing opposition that was irritating. All the people in Boston wanted to do was be left alone. And all that resistance caused the British to decide to show these upstarts in Boston, and this is all in Boston. I think it's fair to say the cutting edge of revolution was these people in Boston. I mean, obviously, it took the whole other colonies to make it happen. But in 1768, the British thought it would be a good idea to send 2,000 to 3,000 troops into Boston to show these people who is the master. And to me, 1768 was the beginning of a big transformation, because if you're going to treat me like an enemy, I'll start to act like your enemy. And it's so appropriate for today. That's what, at the end of the book, there's this little section, Lessons Learned. And if you treat me like an enemy, eventually I will become your enemy. So 1768, people like you and me know about the massacre and the Tea Party and Lexington and Concord, but for me, the die were cast in 1768. And the person, Ebenezer McIntosh, that I hope you will remember, was a lowly shoemaker, and he lived on the South End, and he was able to generate large crowds because he had been given by his fellow South Enders the kind of role of, if we're going to have a riot, I'm the man that'll call it. I don't know how he gained that legitimacy, but Ebenezer McIntosh could literally turn out 2,000 people when he said it's time to turn out. So these protests he was critical for. And this is a lowly shoemaker. At the end of his life, he didn't have enough money to get on a horse to move to New Hampshire, which is what he did. He walked to New Hampshire. But in the meantime, he was huge. And you'll see in this book the coming together of Samuel Adams, the ultimate brilliant organizer, with Ebenezer McIntosh. Because if you can say, let's raise hell, but these Harvard boys didn't know quite how to do it like Ebenezer McIntosh. So it's a story that I want to read one vignette because partly as an early childhood advocate, but here's the scene. One of the customs officials has been really irritating the citizens. It's a night scene. Again, it's in early March, and they're chasing this guy. Actually, another Ebenezer Richardson is his name. So they chase him into his house, and he goes to the second floor, and they're throwing some rocks and stuff. So it's not like there isn't a level of violence at this period perpetrated by the citizens of Boston. But he gets his musket and he fires into the crowd. So that's the scene. And I want to just, if I may, it was Christopher Cider, 11-year-old boy. One killing added a massive amount of fuel to the flame of resistance, taking it to an entirely new level. On a cold February night, an angry mob was boisterously harassing custom official Ebenezer Richardson on his way home. As the crowd began to throw stones and sticks at him, Richardson scurried into his house. The house was pelted with rocks, shattering windows. Richardson ran upstairs, grabbed his musket, and fired it through a window, injuring one young person and killing 11-year-old Christopher Cider with 11 pellets of birdshot to his small torso. Christopher Cider's funeral was said to be, I'm not making this up, Christopher Cider's funeral was said to be the largest ever seen in America up to that point. Samuel Adams had helped ensure the maximum political theater, and 500 schoolboys marched in front of the solemn procession, and thousands followed. None of the participants would forget it. The Gazette was kind of the liberal newspaper. I mean, liberal conservatives, a little different then. The Gazette and Adams would continue to inflame the citizenry and elevate the dead boy to hero status. The tragic killing hung over Boston like a black cloud. Days later, another confrontation further escalated the anger, ill will, and desire to strike out. That next thing was the Boston Massacre. So just imagine how the people were feeling before the Boston Massacre. And this, I'm really touched by the fact that the death of this 11-year-old child would generate that many people. Again, it's only a town of 15,000. And so I think in terms of understanding the emotional background for the events, that was huge. So in March 5th, 1770, the massacre did occur. In my opinion, my humble opinion, it's a total misnomer. But Samuel Adams decided to call it a massacre. And 5 people were killed, and it was not intentional on the part of the British soldiers. It was very bad to be shooting, but there was a lot of accidental activities and understandings. So that has stuck, as you know, up until today, the idea it's a massacre. Massacres are, I'm going to go kill that large group of people, in my opinion. But Samuel Adams deserves so much credit for the whole resistance. It started, we just want our rights as British subjects. And then after 1768, and then after these events, it became very different. And incidentally, the killers were defended by young John Adams, which really made the family kind of unhappy in the sense that he was a brilliant lawyer, and he's going to defend these killers. And to me, the significance of this, and I think you lawyers in the room would appreciate it, John Adams, I think at some gut level understood the rule of law needs to occur. There needs to be an honoring of the notion that no matter who or what, there is a rule of law. And once again, that couldn't be more timely in terms of what's going on today. So the other hero, there are 2 people I want to just briefly talk about. Crispus Attucks has been called the first martyr of the Revolution. He was one of the victims killed. And he was, his heritage was indigenous on his mother's side and African on his father's side. And Crispus Attucks, in this book, looms large as an influence on James Otis and as kind of a model. I just think the fact that the first, I didn't make up the phrase first martyr, is a man of that heritage, it just seems to me like, hello? The 2 sins of American history embodied in this guy who was the first martyr of the Revolution. I just think it means something. And so he was very important. But for me, the superstar in many ways is Mercy. Mercy Otis Warren was the younger sister of James Otis. And she persuaded her parents to be able to go study under their uncle, just like the boys got to do. And the nature of education then for a lot of people was you learn 2 or 3 people under a mentor and teacher. And girls don't do that. I mean, it's just not what they do. But Mercy never got that memo. And so she lobbied her parents and got them to agree that she too would study and learn. And she became the most gifted, articulate leader of the kind of written and theatrically presented word. And so I thought you might enjoy. She wrote poems and she wrote plays. And as it went on, the plays got more and more political, not naming the names of the politicians, but the bad guy in this book is Thomas Hutchinson, the governor. He was lieutenant governor and then governor. Happened to be the case that the very time that the writs of assistance case was tried, he was both the chief judge in the Superior Court and lieutenant governor. two major roles and two separate branches. Something about maybe today we ought to try to honor the notion of not having people violate that sense of separate power. But I just wanted to read you an excerpt from Mercy's play called The Idolater. And don't forget, this is at a period now when things, I think, are no longer warm and fuzzy, like we just want to be British subjects. And she's explaining she's describing in a play called The Idolater, the results of the massacre. And in this, Servia is Boston, and Brutus is James Otis. But here's what she says. The inhuman soldiers stamped the hostile ground, his garments stained with blood. The streets of Servia sweat with human gore. O Brutus, I'm on fire. Hand me my sword and give me to the foe. And if we die, let's die like men and bravely fall expiring on the foe. That man dies well who sheds his blood for freedom. That phrase, that man dies well who sheds his blood for freedom, is a very powerful, give me liberty or give me death kind of thing, but even said better, in my opinion. So the combination of Sam Adams doing what he does, he's a tax collector. He's not a rich guy. He blew away money that his father and the brewery inherited. His deal was being an organizer, and also by being a tax collector in a town of 15,000 people, you get to know everybody. And so the combination of Mercy and Sam, I think, was hugely important in moving people's attitudes. And Mercy deserves enormous credit. She was mentioned twice in the Brandeis graduation speech by Ken Burns, whose series will be starting, I think, on the 16th, Friday? Yeah, and what a genius he is. So just a little sidebar, I reached out to them when I heard this was happening, like 8 months ago now. I said, well, could you maybe consider this period in history too? And even by then, they had done it was so ready for prime time that there's no mention of Otis or any of this. I mean, I think he does mention Lexington and Concord, and this book ends, at least toward the very end, with Lexington. But he's a genius, and so I really look forward to seeing that. But I do think this period in history is underappreciated. And I think the citizens of Boston are underappreciated. And so the ideas and ideals, you'll read a thing called The Rights of British Citizens Asserted and Proved, written by Otis in 1764. It just is the same melody as the Declaration of Independence, the same assumption. And it took guts to do this. It took a lot of guts to do it. And so I think it's a wonderful period. At the end, I do have, well, I'll read you another Adams quote if I could. This is after Otis had died, Adams, he basically said, I was young and now I'm old, and between 1760 and 1770, James Otis was unparalleled in terms of a leader. Of all leaders, he'd seen no man in a decade had shown more presence and leadership. And so once again, a validation at the end of the book by John Adams was great. I just wanted to kind of wrap it up by, there are some lessons learned. In addition to what I just said about if you treat me like an enemy, I will become your enemy. The strategic planning of the Tea Party. And the basic deal was it was so much more complicated than just some guys deciding to dump tea in the bay. It was like, I don't know, I don't want to go too long because we got to wrap soon, but basically they had the planners, the Sam Adams, Hancock, by now Joseph Warren, a wonderful doctor, was a key planner of the Tea Party. They said, we can't let the tea come in, but we got to somehow make a statement. So in New York and Philadelphia, as I understand it, the city leaders kept it out of the area where once it passes a certain point, you have to let the ship in. But in Boston, they let the ship, the schemers and dreamers, the Sam Adams and Joseph Warren, let the ship in. And then they had a strategy to make it look like they wanted to return it. And so why would they do that? Because they wanted to look like they weren't the hellraisers that they really were. They wanted to appear like, oh, well, couldn't we just send it back? But all the British rules said, no, once it's in, you got 16 days to unload it. And so they had a plan for visibly asking the governor to send it back, knowing full well he would say no, but not sure that he would say no, because it would be breaking the rules. But so they ask him, they formally ask him, and the governor says, no, you can't send it back. So then why that's significant politically is that the city people in Boston who needed to get support from the country people who were not part of this kind of more radical or lefty or whatever you want to call it group. This a blatant attempt to look like you're trying to send it back peacefully gave them cover with their country friends, if that makes any sense. So you know what happened. What happened, and the Tea Party occurred. The analogy I make to today is the civil rights movement. And I'm reading a book right now about, it's called Waging a Good War. And it's about the incredible planning of what went on in the different towns and the different protests and the discipline. So for me, an analogy strategically is, you don't just have a sit-in, la-di-da. It's a huge amount of planning that they did, and they deserve credit for. And then the final point was, ideals really matter. Big ideals like truth, justice, equity, and freedom. I mean, the sense that you have rights, these are motivating forces that take you beyond your own personal life. And I think it's easy to, we're so close to them and we take so much for granted for so many of them that I think falling back in love with the big ideals, even if people say, oh, you're so idealistic, those are the things that unite us. And I think in some ways, if we could celebrate those ideals together on both sides of the polars that we have today, that would be really wonderful. So when I was done with the book and I couldn't do any more, and it was published, which I felt very grateful for, there were two insights I had. One, when you read the book, you'll see one of the most appealing people is the only fictional person who has a main role, Beth Frothingham, a maid or a barmaid at the Green Tavern restaurant, tavern. And she is full of spirit, full of life. You'll see when you read that she stands up to British soldiers, and she's great. And after I could no longer touch the book, it was done, it was way out of my hands, I realized who she was. She was Lady Liberty. And people would stand up for her if she was being abused in the tavern, and they would fight for her, and she was feisty, and they loved her. She was Lady Liberty. And the other insight I had, which I wish I'd written in the book, was ultimately what these people created. And we have been, as a country trying to get better and better is a gift. And the gift was exactly the formation of a democracy with no other authority beyond God in terms of where your legitimacy as a citizen comes from. It's not a monarch anymore. It was huge. And at least I've taken it for granted for so long that it's not fully appreciated, but they gave us a gift that needed to be improved in terms of who could vote. They gave us a gift that needed to be improved as to who could be empowered and who could be discriminated against. And men and women through the decades and centuries have fought to make this gift even better. I like the analogy of democracy as it got reformed as a result of some of the problems and issues in the period that I wrote about, is a container. And it is a beautiful jeweled box. And inside that box is freedom, the ultimate jewel. And so when you start to erode the box, freedom in different ways will be next. So I thought the metaphor of a gift, for me, I thought that's what they gave us. And it's had to be improved. Believe me, I appreciate that. And brave men and women have done that, but what a gift. So part of our job, and I think this past week has been somewhat encouraging in terms of the gift, is to make sure we prize it and honor it. And I guess with that, I will wrap. But thank you for the chance to visit with you.
Questions, folks?
Take the speaker so our folks at home can hear the questions you might ask. John?
Thank you very much. Could you talk a little bit about your time in the legislature and these ideals that you've inherited and how they informed your time in the legislature?
Well, when you ask that, I have a flash forward. First of all, in the Minnesota House, who you get to look at all afternoon and evening is Abraham Lincoln. And I just love that. He was my hero from age 12. So being in the House just at that level, getting to look at him, because for me, he's the standard of how you act, how you be. Even with conflict, you don't hate people, but you love your higher principles. So part of it was just looking at Abe. Part of it was how we treated each other. And for me, the signature story about that was I had a bill related to utility rate regulation, and it would change it, and the utility companies did not like it. And you're supposed to have 68 votes to pass a bill. I only had 66 as I went into the session, but I still thought, who knows, you got to give it a shot. And I was being interrogated by a guy that I really kind of liked, a small businessman from Litchfield, Adolph Quam, and he just, what about this? What about that? Don't you know this? And at the very end, when we were finished, both sides had their chance to speak. He turned around. He was in the front of the chamber. I was in the back. And he gave me a big wink. And to me, the wink is everything. I mean, the bill passed for reasons that may not be that interesting, but the fact that Adolf turned around and gave me the wink, that's what we need back. So it was a period where you could just beat your brains out trying to pass a bill, but the animosity was not there. And we had pro-life DFLers from outstate. So to some extent, the element of certain issues not just having to be automatically Democratic or Republican, that was another reality that has changed. But I really, every year that goes by, it's a better experience that I had. In other words, it gets glowier and glowier. I forget the 2.5 hours of hearing the same testimony and the boring technical amendments. Now I just think it was wonderful.
Anybody else?
I'm sure you've done a lot of research focusing on that point in time. And there's something I've always wondered about, communication among people in the colonies at the time. Like, how did the news get around? And like you said, the ideals were so important. How did those ideals get spread among this rural and not very populated area, that there could develop some kind of a consensus around the revolution and doing this? How did the word get around?
I think it was a combination of how did these ideas and ideals get spread broader beyond the core group of people who were articulating them. I think it was a combination of the newspapers and of word of mouth. Again, I got to emphasize the size of Boston. Yeah, it's really not very big, and so I think the combination of the Gazette and the Chronicle, the Gazette was more pro-revolution. Not, again, at the beginning, nobody wanted this revolution, but I think it was a combination of word of mouth, and then to some extent, when they needed to actually politicize it more and get more explicit agreement about certain ideals and actions, they would just have to ride their horses between communities and around Massachusetts, and then eventually other colonies as well, as the formation of a interim kind of governing occurred. So it was, but I mean, what we take for granted, it wasn't like Sam Adams said, no, here's what we ought to do. What do you think? And we take that so for granted now. But on the other hand, I think one of the things about it is that it was so personal. So the kind of like social media that can really make things not good wasn't there either. So people knew each other, knew who to trust and who not to. I think it was that kind of a combination.
Was it mail delivery? Mail?
Mail? Yeah. That's true. There had to have been mail being delivered, right.
So this sort of centered on Boston. When we were down in Charleston, South Carolina, maybe, I don't know, 5 or 10 years ago, there was a lot of talk down there among people that we were doing walking tours with about how Charleston and Boston were the two centers of the revolution, and that the connection between the two cities, they were both big port cities, and that probably didn't come through in your book because you were focused mostly on Boston? But did you do any research into the connection with Charleston with the revolution?
I didn't, and I think that's certainly a valid point. It's very enclosed within this small group of people, and later there were outreaches, but I really, except for one little scene in Providence, I just am not going down the coast. I make reference. I make reference to Charleston when Crispus Attucks was a whaler as well as other things that he did. And so when at one point one of the customs officials thought it would be a good idea to try to track him down, early in the book, Otis asked Crispus, "Are you a free man or a slave?" And Crispus says, "Yes." And so he, and the way I understand why he didn't get brought back to the place in Framingham was that there are too many buddies, fellow whalers and others who do not want you to mess with Crispus. And so at one point when they didn't know where he was, he might have been in Charleston, or he might have been in New York. But I don't otherwise make that connection.
Could you tell us a little bit about how you did your research and how long it took you to, have enough to begin to write this down?
I think that I used multiple sources, books. The biography of James Otis was written in 1828 by one of John Adams' clerks. It's a very interesting format, but so I kind of started with that, and then I would read about individual people in books, and then there's this really remarkable person who did daily messaging online named J.L. Bell, and he would write about different aspects of this period. So maybe 10% of the stuff that he would write I could use. I Googled some stuff, and but in terms of original research, there are quotes from definite original sources that are accurate, but I was not in Boston looking up new stuff. So it was a combination of books, articles, J.L. Bell, and then it probably took two and a half years of just researching, and then another 2.5 years of writing and then getting it edited. And I really appreciate, like, Patricia Francisco. I don't know if anybody's read her, but she was willing to read the book. I paid her to do it, but hugely important. I had it in the first person. She said, that ain't gonna work. She was absolutely right. And so I had it back and forth that way, and then with another editor that the publisher recommended, and he made it better. And so I'd say about 5 years. And I feel very grateful. It is hard to be an unknown person and get published. And so I'm incredibly grateful. And when I was despairing of this, I told my brother, I can't get an agent. In fact, I would feel lucky to get an agent's rejection. Most of them just ignored me. So finally I said, Pocky, my nickname, my brother, I don't know what I'm gonna do. He said, well, why not try David Yanowski, who used to run the Hungry Mind bookstore in St. Paul. And he grew up in our neighborhood, and Pocky was in his class. So I tried him, and David Yanowski had this connection with the publisher, and the publisher, that's the only way I got published. And it's had nice blurbs and good response, but man alive, am I grateful that it ever saw the light of day.
Todd, this is not a question, but just to let everybody know, the current issue of Atlantic Magazine just came out, has a wonderful series of articles about the Declaration of Independence and things that happened that year. One of which, interestingly, has to do with slavery, and the role of slavery in the impetus for the southern colonies to be in favor of the revolution, to preserve the institution of slavery. But there are just several wonderful articles in the current version of the Atlantic Magazine, and I strongly recommend it.
Slavery came up in this book, and Crispus calls Otis on that, and there's a quote in here by Otis about slavery itself that is extremely emphatically anti-slavery.
I was curious with the Worth Fighting For. I saw it on the, the list, and I just attended for the first time a meeting in my neighborhood in Longfellow of the Worth Fighting For group. Are you aware of the national movement, the resistance movement that's called Worth Fighting For? And have you had any connections with them. It started last.
With what
after
group?
It started after Trump was reelected, and in January, at least the group in Longfellow started meeting, and it's all about resistance to the current administration. So it's basically, you know, and so I wondered how much you're aware of that, or
No, but I appreciate you telling me, but I'm not.
Yeah. Apparently, right after the election last year, there were national groups that had online, Zoom calls with people across the country, and it led to the formation of this resistance movement called Worth Fighting For. So look for, there are apparently chapters across the metro and across the country if you want to be part of the modern day resistance.
Could we talk afterwards about that? One of the things that you're making me think is my partner, Karen, is continually educating me about what this is about. It's not about sales of books. It's about the core messages. And so I'd love to try to connect with people who are thinking about that kind of a big picture. So maybe we could talk about that.
Well, I think we've come to the end, but it's not totally end. We need to give Todd another round of applause.
Thank you. If you want a book, we have some books.
The books are over here. And then also, I just want to announce that next week should be a really good session also. It's a panel discussion. Our own Katie Dillon, who's the director of Align Minneapolis, is going to kind of coordinate a panel discussion on housing and homelessness. And there are going to be the panel members. Somebody's from Beacon, there's county person, and there's a state person, and there's two people who have been homeless but apparently aren't now. But it should be a fascinating panel discussion. So that's next week. John? How much is the book? How much is it, and how do people pay for it? Someone gave me some money. I got to give it to you, but. Thanks, Todd.